My name is Rosetta, and even though I'm 22 now, memories of a house that will forever symbolize not only my childhood but also the trials fate has sent our family through are still fresh in my mind. I just graduated from college, and looking back, I realize that the house I live in holds too many stories and too much pain to simply call it walls and a roof. Technically, it belonged to my mother. But after her death 4 years ago, when colon cancer took from me the only person capable of loving me unconditionally, the house became mine, and since then, I feel like she's still there every day. My mother was always a woman of remarkable composure, planning everything in advance, as if she knew the short time fate had in store for her, and even before the diagnosis, she made sure my life had as few accidents as possible, leaving me not only a home but also a clear understanding that I would always have a place where I was safe. I remember her words, spoken in a calm, almost indifferent voice, though inside she must have been torn with pain. "You will always have a home, Rosetta." She looked straight into my eyes, and there was something unforgettable in that look, a mixture of tenderness and determination so rare in people, but so natural to her. Of course, our life wasn't always so difficult. When I was little, we lived a fairly ordinary family, and my parents' marriage lasted 10 years before my father decided to leave us for another woman. I remember that day well. I was 9, when, without scandal or loud words, he simply packed his bags and left. No drama, no lawsuits, he didn't even fight over property or the right to see me. The only thing he promised and kept was to pay for my college education, opening an account and immediately transferring the entire amount he deemed necessary. It was probably his peculiar version of alimony, an attempt to compensate for the lack of financial stability in my life. He quickly settled into his new life, married a woman named Deborah, 10 years his junior, and soon they had a daughter. I would occasionally visit them at their rented house, but I never felt like part of the family there. Deborah was too busy with my half-sister, either complaining about her behavior or fixing her hair, and my father always said he had to work long hours because he now had a new family to provide for. It's funny how, in his mind, I no longer fit into that category. And even when Deborah invited me to dinner with the words, "Rosetta, would you like to join us?" her tone made it clear she was hoping I'd refuse. Our relationship remained formally friendly. We exchanged cards on birthdays and Christmases, and occasionally met at the same table, but it was all filled with such awkward politeness that it made my skin crawl. Deep down, I knew I was a stranger to them, and they were a stranger to me. Meanwhile, my mother continued working as a senior accountant, earning enough to provide a decent living for both of us. But when I was 14, the doctors diagnosed her with cancer, and without a second thought, she quit, deciding to devote all her energy to fighting the disease. From then on, our life became a series of hospital corridors, procedures, and hopes that would flare and then fade. 4 years of struggle, 4 years of hope and fear, and all this time, my mother never complained, never allowed herself to weaken, continuing to plan and care for me, as if she believed she could still control fate. But cancer, as it turned out, knows no mercy and obeys no plans. I was 18 when she died, just a few weeks before I left for college in another state. Grief crashed down on me like an avalanche. I could barely breathe, barely understood how to continue living, and then something happened that I least expected. My father showed unexpected concern. He wasn't alone. Deborah and my half-sister were with him, and they temporarily moved into our house to help me cope with the loss, so I wouldn't be left alone in the empty rooms with my pain. And although their presence was foreign and unusual to me, in that moment I felt for the first time that even the most difficult relationships can change when life demands that we be there for each other, no matter what. At the time, I was too numb to question or doubt the sincerity of their intentions, too grateful for any support that even slightly eased the burden that had fallen on my shoulders since my mother's death. "A week will help you cope," my father said, putting his arm around my shoulders, and I allowed myself to lean on his strength, as if I were a little girl again, still believing that parents can protect you from any harm. Deborah nodded at that moment, trying to force a compassionate expression onto her face, and I caught myself thinking that for the first time I saw in her eyes not cold politeness, but at least an attempt at warmth, however awkward. And Bianca, my half-sister, rushed excitedly through the rooms, examining every corner, as if this house, which was now mine, was already beginning to become her home too. But along with the relief came a dilemma. In a few weeks, I was supposed to leave for college, and the question of what to do with my mother's house weighed on me day and night. The thought of selling felt like a betrayal, as if I could erase my mother's memory by exchanging her for money, but leaving the house empty for 4 years also felt wrong, as if the walls that once swarmed with laughter and conversation shouldn't be silenced. It was then, at breakfast, with the sun streaming through the curtains and fresh toast and mugs of hot coffee on the table, that my father cautiously broached the subject. "Rosetta," he said, pushing his cup aside, "I was thinking, what if we stay here? We'll pay all the bills, keep everything in order, and you won't have to worry about anything while you're studying." His voice was calm, but I detected a note of both a request and a promise of care. I glanced at Deborah, standing at the stove with a spatula in her hand, and she turned and smiled so naturally, as if offering me something she took for granted. "It will be good for all of us," she said softly. "Bianca is already enrolled in the local school, and we will take care of the house as it deserves." The words rang true, and to my surprise, I felt my anxiety temporarily recede. The 2 months they lived with me passed surprisingly calmly. Deborah stopped being distant and began to show a concern I hadn't seen from her before, and Bianca began to treat me not as an infrequent visitor, but as a sister, someone I could come to for advice or just for a chat. So when my father and Deborah offered to stay, I agreed, believing it truly was the best decision. I packed my mother's things slowly, with a heavy heart, keeping the most precious things for myself, and carefully putting the rest in boxes and carrying them to the attic. It was a difficult process. Every dress, every book, every little thing reminded me of her, and yet I knew it was for the best. And then the day of departure arrived. I boarded a train bound for another state, and for the first time, I left home with the feeling that it would be in good hands. Over the next 4 years, I returned only for holidays and summer vacations, and each time I stepped through the door, I felt welcome. "Deborah threw veritable feasts. I made your favorite lasagna," she'd say with a smile, as if she'd always known my tastes, even though we'd rarely shared anything personal in the past. Bianca, beaming, would pull me into her room, showing me her drawings or telling me stories of school dramas, and her voice carried the joy a younger sister feels when she can share something important. At Christmas, we decorated the tree together, and in those moments, I almost forgot that this wasn't the family I'd started my life with. Dad would pick up Bianca, lifting her to the very top so she could secure the star, while Deborah and I would argue about whether the decorations were too gaudy or, on the contrary, cozy, and the argument always ended in laughter. We would sit in the living room with mugs of hot chocolate, the light of the fairy lights reflecting in the windows, and for a moment, I felt as if the world was whole again. In the summer, our gatherings were different, lighter and more carefree. Bianca and I would spend days by the public pool, sunbathing on the warm stones, or sitting in the garden, and I would help her with her school books, giving her advice on how to write essays. Deborah would invite me to her book clubs, where I unexpectedly found pleasure in discussing romance novels with women of all ages, each with her own perspective on the heroes and their destinies. Sometimes I caught myself thinking that these evenings with a cup of wine and conversations about imaginary passions were a real relaxation for me. "Rosetta gets along so well with Bianca," Deborah would say, and there was genuine warmth in her voice, not feigned, as if she truly believed we had become a family, albeit one made up of different pieces of each other's stories. One evening, I overheard Deborah telling Papa that she loved having her own home, and that simple phrase, spoken between the clatter of plates and the soft sound of water in the sink, warmed me as if the broken pieces of our lives had finally come together into some temporary, proper pattern. I allowed myself to believe that this home, which had once been just Mama's, had now truly become our shared space, warmed not only by the light of the lamps but also by the desire not to hurt each other. I called them regularly during semesters. Weekly conversations with Dad about my classes and projects were my anchor, and Deborah and I, amazing allies in everyday life, discussed the most mundane things, from convenient technology to how to make a bed, and in these conversations, a quiet but genuine care seemed to be born. the roses that Mom had once painstakingly planted along the path still bloomed beautifully, and FaceTime sessions with Bianca, where she recounted everything that had happened in high school with a touch of drama, kept me updated on her little world, and then everything truly seemed perfect. We created a strange but functional family, a dynamic built on the foundation of my mother's home, and I never imagined that the strength of that foundation would be so quickly called into question. But houses, like people, keep their secrets behind their walls, and no one knows when a quiet rustling will turn into a crack. I finally turned 22, got my diploma, and received a job offer from Marshall and Brooks Financial in my hometown. The interview took place over Zoom, and at the time, still not fully accustomed to the idea of adult independence, it felt like all the pieces had come together: school, apartment, job. A taxi dropped me off in front of my house one sunny June day, and I lingered for a moment, taking in the familiar sight. My mother's rose bushes were in full bloom, though not as seasoned as they once were. The lawn was neatly trimmed, new curtains hung on the windows, and the small changes over the years of my absence felt like the caring hand of those who had lived there while I was gone. I lugged my suitcases down the path, smiling to myself and imagining snuggling up to my pillow in my old room that evening. But when I pulled out my keys and tried to open the door, something went wrong. The key wouldn't turn in the lock. At first, I chalked it up to fatigue from the journey, but a second and third push produced the same result: it wouldn't fit. What the hell? I muttered to myself and knocked loudly, because it was the middle of the day and maybe they were just in the living room. Deborah opened the door, and I saw her in an apron, dusted with flour, her cheeks pink from the heat of the oven, her eyes wide with surprise at the sight of me. "Rosetta, what are you doing here?" she blurted out, and I carried the suitcase inside, noticing my father in my mother's old chair, engrossed in his tablet, and Bianca, sprawled on the sofa with her phone in her hand, both looking as surprised by my sudden appearance as Deborah herself. I'm back," I said, trying to keep my voice from betraying my confusion, and looked around, trying to find an explanation for the changed decor and the little details that seemed insignificant, but seemed to indicate that life here was going on as usual. "What do you mean? I live here?" I asked, because the thought of selling or foreclosing the house flashed before my eyes for a moment, and I couldn't bear either possibility. At this point, Dad ran his hand across his neck, a familiar nervous gesture he'd made for ages when he didn't know how to start a conversation more seriously than usual, and said calmly, but with that awkward attempt at being protective he always displayed, "Oh, yeah, I changed them last month for security. You know, there's been a lot of break-ins in our neighborhood." You could have told me I say this, trying to hide the irritation in my voice that rises like a hot wave in my chest and is barely contained behind a smile, or sent a new key, because this is my house, we weren't expecting you, and these words fall from my mouth easier than the pain, but just as sharply, because home is not just bricks and a roof, it is a memory. The smell of my mother's clothes in the attic and the mark on the chair where she sat in the evenings, and I cannot accept the feeling that all of this has become someone else's temporary space. Deborah carefully crosses her arms over her chest, wipes the flour from her hands and looks increasingly awkward, as if trying on a role of hostess that she has not trained for and that cannot be achieved by simple desire. And I continue, without looking away, "Why not? I graduated last week. I told you I was coming back to start work. I already signed the offer," and my voice trembled with a mixture of reproach and hope, because I wanted to believe they accepted everything honestly and conscientiously. Silence fell over the room. Bianca put her phone down and watched us with a strange expression that read offense, curiosity, and perhaps a vague anxiety, and my father suddenly stood up and quietly said, "Can we talk in the office for a minute?" And I, not knowing what else to expect, followed him into my mother's old room, where diplomas still hang on the wall, and on the shelves are her financial reference books, smelling of rare pages and evenings of work. The door closes behind us, and I notice that his hands are shaking slightly as he turns to me. He always does that when he's wavering between the truth and relief, and I listen to him lower his voice. "Listen, honey," and I know immediately that he's about to say something that should have been said before but was put off for fear of hurting someone. "There's something you need to know. he continues, each word washed out of his mouth by a heavy bloom. Deborah thinks this house is hers. I look at him, not understanding at first, and the floor in the room seems to collapse beneath my feet as the meaning of his sentence expands and grows louder. I gave it to your mother after the divorce out of the kindness of my heart, and when she died, it came to me, and she lives here because I let her. At that moment, I stood there, mentally reviewing all the facts I knew and those I didn't. And my first impulse was to run into the living room, grab Deborah by the apron, and tell her the whole truth, to show her the will, scratched out in my mother's hand, but instead, I heard my father, his voice low and almost a whisper, begging, "Please, Rosetta, just give me a little time, I'll find us a new place, I promise. I need to figure out how to tell her without ruining our marriage." His palms, large and warm, hold out something invisible. He looks lost. And I mentally bridge the gap between who he was to me before and the man who now begs for mercy. Anger, sharp and hot, rises within me. "What about what you're doing to me?" bursts from my lips, and at that moment my father takes a ring of keys from his pocket, holding them out to me as an offer of peace, as a sign that he's trying to maintain control of the situation, not realizing how much humiliation this gesture carries for his daughter, to whom someone is trying to hand over disguised compensation. "It's for new locks. Please, sweetheart, just a few weeks, that's all I ask. Let me handle this my way." His voice is filled with both pleading and fear of loss. And I, holding the keys, feel nausea churning inside, because these words don't erase the hurt or restore the lost trust. Finally, I say, "Okay," and I hear how this okay sounds utterly tired, because the willingness to give in is also tired of the struggle. Tired of loneliness and of constantly deciding who to be when everyone around you is trying to reshape your life. "But that's crazy, Dad, you know that, right?" And he nods slowly, and I see relief spread across his face, as if he already feels better from my agreement. He squeezes my hand, and quietly, almost in a whisper, says, "Thank you, darling, I will fix everything, I promise." Everything went awry at dinner, even though I'd convinced myself that morning that if I behaved calmly and with restraint, I might be able to restore at least a semblance of the former coziness to the house. But the atmosphere at the table was so tense that you could stick a knife straight into thin air and it would stick there, as if in thick dough. Deborah sat across from me, casting glances at me that I could feel their sharpness on my skin like needles, all her former friendliness, the same kind woman who once baked my favorite cinnamon vanilla cookies and once even invited me to her book club, had vanished without a trace. In her place sat a strange, cold, distant hostess who looked at me as if I were an uninvited guest who had accidentally dropped in from the street. I tried to take a bite of a fry to keep my mouth occupied and avoid saying anything harsh, but just then, Bianca, completely oblivious to the tense silence, cheerfully asked if it would be possible to remodel the living room. Her words hung in the air, and I felt my fingers curl around my fork, because this living room was the heart of Mom's home, her furniture arranged exactly as she'd arranged it, and every item there held her presence. Deborah, without looking at me, said, "The current decor is a bit dated," and I barely restrained myself from retorting. Dad coughed awkwardly, looked away, and quickly changed the subject, as if he feared we would all descend into conflict right there, over dinner. The next morning, as I was making coffee, enjoying a few rare minutes of silence, Deborah suddenly entered the kitchen, cornering me. She was still in her robe, her hair disheveled, but her gaze was sharp and focused, like someone who knows exactly what she's about to say and where it will lead. "Rosetta," she said, leaning against the counter, "I think we need to talk about your plans." I asked, though I understood perfectly well. "My plans?" She nodded and, with a slight casualness, as if asking about the weather, said, "Yes, when are you planning on looking for your own place? Now that you have a job, it's time you started thinking about moving. You're a grown woman, after all." I sipped my coffee slowly, silently counting to 10, feeling a hot wave of indignation building in my chest. "Actually," I replied calmly, "I've already talked to Dad about staying here for now. He's fine with it." I saw her lips press into a thin line, as if she were about to object, but she held back. Instead of shouting or arguing, she simply turned abruptly and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with my cooling coffee and a heavy sense of dread about what this could all lead to. The next 2 weeks were spent in a constant struggle with the shadow that hung over the house. Living in a hostile environment was becoming unbearable. Her attitude toward me changed from cold indifference to downright passive-aggressive. She would accidentally wash my light-colored clothes with my dark ones and then shrug guiltily, claiming she'd forgotten which basket belonged to me. She cooked family dinners, but only for 3, and when I sat down at the table, her surprise seemed so genuine, as if I'd intruded on someone else's meal. Every time I tried to relax and watch TV in the living room, she'd suddenly decide to vacuum there, oblivious to the fact that I was sitting right next to her. As soon as I started making breakfast in the kitchen, she'd come in and start rearranging the cabinets, quietly muttering about how some people never learn to keep things tidy. She even dared to touch the most sacred thing, my mother's favorite vase, which had stood on the mantel for years as a silent symbol of her taste and presence, and moved it to a far corner shelf, explaining that it was out of place in the new interior design concept. But the worst thing was watching Bianca change. The same girl who, not long ago, sent me funny memes and called me in the evenings for boyfriend advice now rolled her eyes when I walked into the room and pointedly turned away. She even stopped calling me by my name and started referring to me as that girl, and she did it deliberately loudly enough so I could hear her when she was talking to her friends on the phone. And so I stood in my own kitchen, a cup in my hand, in a house that had recently seemed like a fortress of my memories and my family, and I realized that the walls were still as strong and the foundation still supported the weight, but the house had long ceased to be mine. My professional life was rapidly gaining momentum, as if someone invisible were pushing me forward, toward a new reality where schedules, plans, goals, and business conversations took center stage, rather than the heavy sighs and caustic remarks I'd become accustomed to in my final weeks at home. When I first walked through the doors of Marshall and Brooks Financial, I was led through glass-walled, softly carpeted hallways and shown to my future workspace, a small but cozy corner desk overlooking the city center, the intersections where life flowed leisurely but inexorably. My colleagues smiled at me, shook hands, introduced themselves by name, and I especially remembered Sarah from the risk assessment team. Her easy, open manner immediately put me at ease, and soon she invited me to lunch to introduce her to the team. Over sandwiches at a small cafe nearby, she asked, "So, when do you start?" I took a bite and carefully patted my fingers with a napkin before replying, "In 2 weeks, I think that's just enough time to get settled in." She nodded approvingly, and something like sympathy flickered in her eyes, though of course she knew nothing of what was going on in my house. That evening, over dinner, I told the family about the start date, trying to keep my voice cheerful and light, as if it were a casual announcement, and everything around us was calm and stable. "I was shown my office today," I began, and at that moment Deborah's fork clanged sharply against her plate as she placed it on the table with exaggerated care, as if every movement was meant to emphasize what she was about to say. "Isn't that wonderful?" she said, smiling tightly. "As soon as you get your first paycheck, you can look for your own apartment. I know a few good complexes in town that are very affordable for young professionals." I felt my heart clench, but at that same moment I caught my father's gaze across the table, pleading, warm, and full of pain. His eyes practically begged me not to respond, to remain silent, if only to hold on to the fragile semblance of peace that still remained in the house. I buried my face in my plate, picking at my peas, and said nothing, because I knew any word would lead to an argument, and he couldn't stand that. To keep from going crazy in this atmosphere, I began reconnecting with old school friends. Felisa and Kinsey still lived in town, and we began meeting again, sometimes over coffee, sometimes while shopping, and these encounters returned me to my old rhythm, to that life where laughter and chatter flowed easily and naturally, as if the years of separation and change had never existed. But every time I returned home, I felt awkward, as if I were entering a stranger's home. I'd open the door and hear muffled conversations from the kitchen or living room, but as soon as I stepped through the door, the words would suddenly stop, and a heavy silence would descend. Dad and Deborah would go their separate ways like misbehaving teenagers, quickly tucking papers into drawers, their faces lit by smiles too flat, too artificial, for me to believe them genuine. One Saturday, I woke up to an unusual silence. The house was devoid of Bianca's familiar music, the banging of pots and pans that Deborah usually banged in the kitchen on weekends, and Dad's voice, which usually accompanied sports broadcasts on TV, was nowhere to be heard. The silence was somehow wrong. It resembled the calm before a storm, when nature holds its breath, anticipating the clap of thunder. I slowly made my way downstairs in my pajamas, checking each room as I went, as if hoping to catch them off guard, but the kitchen was spotlessly clean, not just tidy, but as if it hadn't been used since the night before. The living room was empty, the throw pillows perfectly arranged on the sofa, as if they'd been straightened just before my arrival. Bianca's boots, usually strewn about, were missing from the hallway. Even Dad's car wasn't parked in the driveway. I grabbed my phone, no messages, no note, no reminder of where they might have gone. My first thought was that maybe they'd decided to go out for breakfast together, but something about that didn't feel right. Even on the busiest days, they never left the house without leaving at least a short note. I dialed Dad's number. It went straight to voicemail. I tried again, and still the same result. The automated voice cut me off from him, like a wall. The knot in my stomach tightened and grew heavier. Then I dialed Deborah's number. She answered only on the fourth ring, just as I was about to hang up. "What do you want?" Her voice was sharp, hostile, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. The sound of waves crashing and something like tropical music played in the background only deepened my confusion. "I just wanted to know where everyone was," I muttered, taken aback by her tone. I woke up and the house was empty. I remembered her laughter cutting through the silence like a chainsaw cutting a branch, harsh, angry, almost celebratory in its cruelty, and there wasn't even a hint of regret in it. She seemed to relish the moment as she dissolved everything precious within me. "Oh, didn't we tell you? We're in the Maldives, at a luxury resort, with first-class flights." The words flowed in a steady stream, each one laced with reproach. "We didn't mention it because, frankly, we didn't want you following us around and expecting us to pay for you." I stood there, listening, feeling the air in the room turn to ice, as if the home I'd saved for my mother, and which she'd saved for me, had suddenly become an arena where I wasn't just disowned, I was literally being pushed out the door. She continued, refusing to give me the opportunity to justify myself, as if reciting a prepared speech. "I'm fed up with this whole situation. You're nothing but a lazy parasite, living in our house as if it were yours. Your father never loved you. You were a burden. He spent enough money on your education, and now you sit in our house like a titled princess." The words flew like sharp arrows, and in the background I heard Bianca's giggles, light as cotton, a sound that had previously seemed sweet to me, but now cut to the heart. Papa's voice, muffled and quiet, as if he were trying to whisper through a storm, muttered something unintelligible. I felt sick, my legs buckling, and I leaned against the familiar kitchen chair, the very one where Mama liked to drink her morning tea. "I want you to go," Deborah continued with a venomous certainty in her voice. "If you're here when we get back, I'll throw you out myself. I don't care where you go. Don't call your father. He agrees with me. He's just too weak to say it himself. We've already blocked your number. I wish you a good life, Rosetta, or not." The line went dead, and my ears rang. The betrayal was a physical sensation, like a punch to the face that made my head spin. I sat in the kitchen for what felt like hours, collecting the fragments of self-respect and mentally weighing possible responses, and gradually rage filled the place of shock. The word freeloader and the promise to throw you out weren't just words, they became the impetus for action. My mother's house, the home she left me, suddenly became a place where my rights and my grief became the subject of ridicule, and I realized, from that moment on, I would no longer cover up their lies with a smile or quiet agreement. First, I did the practical thing. I blocked their numbers in my phone. It wasn't a gesture of alienation, but an act of self-preservation, a boundary marker I'd drawn to keep them from calling me back to that world where I was just a comfortable shadow. My hands were still shaking, but now the trembling was fueled not by fear, but by determination. I began methodically searching the house, examining things through someone else's eyes and seeing in each object an opportunity to reclaim my space. Deborah's expensive clothes, neatly hung in her closet, Bianca's school supplies scattered in drawers, Dad's golf clubs standing in the corner. I categorized them all, stuffed them into boxes and suitcases, labeling them, packing them, and locking them. The work was both monotonous and cathartic. I packed their lives into cardboard containers, hearing in every rustle of paper not only anger but also a strange relief, as if, by taking things outside, I was also taking out the web of petty humiliations in which they had tried to hold me. I writhed in this rhythm all day, until the house began to feel alien and yet, little by little, mine again, because I had begun to control it rather than let it dictate my terms. By Sunday morning, I had packed up their lives and laid them out in the garage. I found a 24-hour locksmith who could come immediately and replaced all the locks on our house in a couple of hours, and yes, it cost a fortune, but every penny seemed worth it when he, wiping the sweat from his brow, handed me a set of new keys, and I, holding them in my hand, felt both relief and a strange satisfaction, like a small victory over those who thought they could decide how I lived my life for me. On Monday morning, I went to work with those new keys in my pocket and dove headfirst into business at Marshall and Brooks. 2 weeks of painstakingly learning the ropes, getting to know my coworkers, and settling into the rhythm of office life that kept me grounded and focused on the inevitable confrontation. I kept the things of those who betrayed me in the garage, but at the same time, I gradually restored my mother's face to the house, removing traces of other people's decor, rearranging the furniture she loved, and straightening the curtains the way she used to. And then, on Friday, after work, I pulled up to the house and saw them in the driveway, my father holding a suitcase, Bianca and Deborah, with suitcases in the rental car. They had just returned from vacation, and their appearance betrayed their fatigue, but before I could get out, Deborah, flushed and already at her wits' end, started screaming, "How dare you change our locks? How dare you lock us out of our own house?" I calmly walked past to open the door, and she continued, unabated, "We're calling the police, it's breaking and entering." But something inside me clicked, and I turned to them, sensing that my reason for speaking wasn't fear, but long-suffering determination. "No, Deborah, this isn't your house, it never was," I replied evenly, my voice unwavering. "This house belongs to me. My mother bought it long before she met your father, and she clearly left it to me in her will. You only live here because I allowed you to stay temporarily." Deborah laughed, but it was hesitant, and she looked at her father with a pleading look. "Tell her she's lying, tell her this is our home." But he couldn't find the words and merely shrugged, lowering his head, as if the truth had proven too difficult. I watched Deborah's face change in a split second, from confident self-assurance to puzzlement to a kind of calculating horror, like the way the light changes in a window when a cloud obscures the sun. Then, as if acquiring a protective mask, she forced out an awkward laugh. "Oh, Rosetta, my dear, what are you saying? I was just joking on the phone. Did you really think I was serious?" All this sun, cocktails, and relaxation have somehow gone to my head. I barely contained my sarcasm as she stepped toward me, as if wanting to hug me, but I didn't back down. Dad intervened, his voice tinged with remorse. "Princess, I'm so sorry, I know I did wrong, but I love you, you're my daughter, let's try to make this right." I looked at him long and hard, at the man who'd left our lives when I was 9, who'd paid for my education and then lived for so long in a world where I was just a passing shadow, and asked quietly, with a sting that refused to subside, "What's wrong with you, Dad? How could you let all this go on? How could you lie to me about my home and your love? The fact that you lied to your wife, convincing her that my mother's house was somehow yours, or the fact that you stood by, silently acquiescing, as she plotted to throw me out the door as if I were some random tenant?" I asked, a cold anger settling in my throat, while my heart pounded with an agonizing insistence, as if it were trying to break through my ribs. Deborah turned to me, a forced smile frozen on her lips, a mixture of despair and false gentleness. "Rosetta, let's be reasonable, we can all live here together, as a family, we'll pay you rent." But I only shook my head, feeling a strange calm descend upon me, as if after years of struggle I'd finally found strength. "No," I said firmly, "we can't. Your things are already in the garage, take them and go." At that moment, Deborah's mask cracked, her eyes flashed, and her voice cut through the air like a shard of glass. "You ungrateful little thing, after everything we'd done for you, would you throw your own family out into the street?" But I remained calm, almost icy. "You just spent $10,000 on a luxury vacation," I said. "And yet you had the nerve to hide it from me. If you could afford a first-class flight, cocktails, and a villa, you can certainly afford to rent an apartment." "Rosetta, please." Dad reached out his hand to me again, his voice pleading, but I cut him off abruptly. "No, Dad, you weren't just mistaken, you lied. You lied for 4 years. You let your wife believe she was the mistress of this house. You watched her cleanse it of my mother's traces, rearranging it, throwing it out, rebuilding it, as if her memory could be erased along with the furniture, and you remained silent. And when she decided to kick me out, you remained silent again." He raised his hands, as if defending himself. "I was going to tell her the truth, after, but I only shook my head, and felt that tears had no power over me at that moment." "After what, Dad?" "After she erases everything Mom left me from this house? After you completely betray me?" "No, it's over, take your things and go." I walked into the house and slammed the door, leaving them outside with their screams and curses. Deborah's shrill voice drifted through the windows, accusing me of ingratitude and cruelty, and I watched as they loaded boxes and suitcases into the rental car. Deborah was still screaming, her face flushed with rage. Bianca was sobbing, and Dad looked broken and defeated, and it seemed to me that he suddenly grew shorter, as if his spine had bowed under the weight of his own choices. It took them 3 trips to carry everything out, and when they loaded the last box, Dad knocked on the door, quietly, almost pitifully, but I didn't open it. Only when the sun was setting and the sky turned purple did the rental car pull out of the driveway, whisking them away. The next day, as if nothing had happened, Dad called from a new number. His voice trembled. "Rosetta, please, we can fix this." But I clenched my teeth and said, "No, Dad, we can't. I heard it all from Deborah. She said it clearly, what you never dared, to you. I'm a parasite, a burden, someone you never loved." Maybe it was her words, but your silence said more than all the confessions. 2 months passed. I was still living in Mom's house, my house. I repainted the walls in new, bright colors, brought back the smell of fresh paint and warmth to the rooms, and planted the roses Mom loved so much in the garden, and the house became mine again, not someone else's, not temporary, but truly mine. Sometimes I thought about them, where they'd gone, how they were living, what they were doing, but most of all, I thought about my mother, about how wisely she'd provided in her will that I would always have a place to return to, a place no one could take away from me. My father still tried to call, sometimes from different numbers, but I no longer picked up. Some bridges, once burned, must remain ashes, and I'd learned to look at those ashes without regret. It's funny, but I became happier. Work was going well, I'd made new friends among my colleagues, and for the first time since the day we lost my mother, I felt peace within these walls. Sometimes healing isn't about rebuilding old connections, but about letting go of lies, stopping believing in the fairy tale of a family that never existed, and choosing the truth, no matter how bitter it may be.